Well, good afternoon. This is Jeff Myers with Director of AMA at the NCAA National Office, here with Louise McCleary, Ali Spungen, Bill Regan, and Josh Smith from the National Office for the Division III December webinar. And we're going to discuss today the legislative proposal for the 2021 Division III NCAA Convention, Name, Image, and Likeness. Hopefully this is not new to all of you. We've been discussing this for the better part of 2 years now, and now coming forward with a proposal to be voted on by the entire membership. This is the beginning really of a series of formats for you as membership to better understand this proposal, to propose questions regarding this proposal, and to certainly discuss this proposal. We've just issued the first edition of the question and answer document that addresses some of the more nuanced questions, a little bit more detail than what we'll be going in today, and that is posted on nca.org. Additionally, at the issues forum at convention, we will discuss this proposal as well and have opportunities for all of you to discuss and provide positions on this proposal as well. But the purpose is to first revisit the process and the background of how this proposal came into being, and then we'll go through what the actual proposal does that we'll be voting on in January. So for starters, I think just to understand what name, image, and likeness, or NIL, is, and we have here any activity that involves the use of a student athlete's name, image, and likeness for promotional purposes. To understand currently the legislation, an institution may use a student athlete's name, image, or likeness to support its institutional promotions. A student athlete or a charitable organization may also use a student athlete's name, image, and likeness for promotional purposes. That's not what's really being addressed here. We're really looking at the limitations on the use of a student athlete's NIL for commercial purposes. Currently, that's allowed in Division III to a certain extent. A student athlete can promote a commercial product, whether it's their own business or promote a third-party product or service, provided they weren't offered that opportunity because they were an athlete, or they're not using their status as an athlete to promote that product. That's where we are currently. This proposal ultimately will change that, but it's important to understand where we're starting from, because the name, image, and likeness issue is much bigger than just a Division III issue. It's an association-wide issue. All three divisions will be voting on some type of name, image, and likeness legislation. While there's similarities, there's also differences, and it's important to understand what the Division III differences are. And Division III is starting from a different place. That we are more permissive in how we allow our student athletes to promote commercial products and services and use their own name, image, and likeness, provided, again, they don't use their status as athletes. So we're starting at a different place, and we'll kind of see where this has all kind of come from. So this really goes back to 2019, when the Board of Governors formed a working group to look at student athlete name, image, and likeness issues across the association. And the impetus for this was legislation out in California that was going to essentially expand the rights of student athletes to use their name, image, likeness for commercial purposes, as well as potential federal legislation that was being proposed. So rather than have legislatures dictate what our legislation should be and how we should operate from an amateurism standpoint, Board of Governors put together this working group to take a look at the current status of NIL legislation, current waivers across the association, and really where we should be as an association. And in October, they sent their findings to 3 divisions to say, essentially, student athletes should benefit from their NIL, but consistent with the collegiate model. And we'll look at what that means specifically for Division III. So what Division III did, they took that information from the Board of Governors. We formed an oversight group to kind of manage this process. And then did what I think Division III does fairly well, is sought feedback from the membership. There was discussions at the NCAA convention. There was discussions from the Student Athlete Advisory Committee. And I think that's a piece we'll keep coming back to, is how involved at the Division III level the student athletes have been in this process. They have been here from the beginning and have very much influenced where we are as a proposal now. The Interpretations and Legislation Committee ultimately really dug into this issue, took the feedback from National SAC, and there was a National SAC member on that committee, took the feedback from the convention, the membership at the convention, and ultimately developed a few concepts for additional feedback and consideration. Then in April, the Board of Governors gave their final report charging the divisions to ultimately propose legislation. Interestingly enough, that report was primarily consistent with the concepts that the Interpretations Committee forwarded on to Management and President's Council. So in April, SAC, Management Council, President's Council reviewed and ultimately endorsed those concepts in conjunction with the final report of the Board of Governors. There were several webinars, including a session at the regional rules to go over what those concepts did. And then the oversight group issued a survey to the entire membership on those concepts. That survey came back largely supportive of what those concepts were. And then ultimately, Management Council and President's Council submitted sponsored legislation that we'll be voting on in January. A couple key takeaways from this process, again, to reiterate, the student athletes have been involved in this process from the beginning, influenced the proposal that you'll be voting on in January, and supportive of that proposal. I think the second piece is the concepts going forward are Division III driven. While ultimately the Board of Governors formed the group based on California legislation that didn't distinguish between divisions, and we certainly know that this is an issue that does focus primarily in the media on Division I. What we found out through the process from the feedback from National SAC, feedback from the membership, this is still a Division III issue. The legislation currently on the books is restrictive, and there's activities that student athletes are doing at the Division III level in which would violate the current amateurism provisions. And we'll get into some of these more details later, but this is a Division III issue. And then the final piece I just want to note is that there was significant membership feedback on these proposals, starting again with the working group, the Board of Governors working group that had Division III president, AD, and student athlete on it, from the feedback at the convention, through National SAC, through the committee structure, as well as the survey, as multiple webinars, been sufficient or effective membership feedback on this issue. Before going on to the proposals, wanted to look at what some of that direction came from the Board of Governors and that working group. And there were primarily three principles that the divisions were asked to follow as they started looking into this issue. And the first one's represented here, and saying essentially that with any compensation to student athletes for their name, image, and likeness to promote commercial products or services, has to ensure, one, that it's not a substitute for pay for play, nor shall it serve as a recruiting inducement to attend a particular school. Second key principle is that any regulations in this space should be transparent and narrowly tailored and enforceable. Admittedly, this is one that we continue to discuss through the membership feedback process, continue to wrestle with not only with the current legislation, but also with the proposal. And we'll discuss some of the feedback in this area a little bit later. And then the final, and this is where the Interpretations Committee really focused on, really thought this final principle was consistent with Division III philosophy and one that should really be the focus or the focal point of this legislation. And that's that student athletes should be able to use their NIL similar to how college students generally may use. And so essentially that student athletes should be treated similar to students on your campus. And that's really where these concepts in the proposal, where it's really focused and where it's based. And so what are the concepts? Well, it is one proposal, but two primary concepts contained in the proposal. And the first one is to say that student athletes may use their NIL or may use their status as athletes. So I think that's an important thing to remember is current legislation, they can use their NIL as long as they're not using their status as athletes to promote their own work product. This concept would just take that a step further and allow student athletes to use their status as athletes to promote their own work product or service. And the second sort of concept or category is that they may use their status as athletes to endorse third-party products or services. And so what are we really looking at here? So to paint a better picture of what these concepts do or what areas we're talking about, the first one, when we talk about work product or services, here are some examples that would fall under these categories. We'll look at a couple of them here. The promotion of private lessons. Under current legislation, student athletes may conduct private lessons and be paid for those private lessons. However, they cannot market themselves as student athletes in providing those lessons. This would open it up and allow them to market themselves as athletes and conduct these lessons. Monetize social media platforms. We are already seeing that now. Student athletes are gaining a following for reasons most likely outside or not due to athletics, and able to monetize their social media platforms. However, if they identify as student athletes on those social media platforms, that's not consistent with current legislation and wouldn't be allowed. This opens it up. This would say they are still allowed to identify as student athletes, use their status as athletes to promote their social media platforms, and ultimately monetize those social media platforms. Creative endeavors and academic endeavors. We've seen that in the past as well, whether it's student athletes authoring books, musical abilities, and so on, allowing them to use their status as athletes to promote those creative endeavors as well. And then with respect to concept number 2, endorsements, a few examples here. More of the traditional type endorsement or promotional type activities. So a local restaurant would use a student athlete to promote their restaurant, to promote their business. We've also seen quite a bit this idea of brand ambassadors, student athletes using their social media platforms to promote a commercial product or service. We see that's happening now, and we largely see it largely after it's already occurring. And so that's one of the issues when we say it's a Division III issue. We see student athletes promoting a product or service. Their status as an athlete is known on that social media platform, and it's impermissible as legislation is currently written. And institutions are finding this out after this is already done, so now there's eligibility issues tied to it. This proposal would say that's okay. They can use their status. And these are the type of activities that are probably currently happening. Institutions may know about it on the front end, but likely are finding out about it after it's already occurred or while it's occurring. And so when we talk about enforceability and compliance, here's an area where we're saying there's currently an issue here. This will hopefully make this more permissible for the student athletes and hopefully less of a compliance burden. And the last one I just wanted to mention was the last one on this slide, is provide testimonials for a product or service. We have seen that in the past as well. And primarily we see it on a medical service provider where the student athlete was a patient of a medical service group where they had their knee repaired or some type of other procedure, and now they're being used in a commercial for that medical service provider. Currently, if they're being identified as a student athlete, being identified as an athlete at all, they can't appear in that commercial. This would open it up and allow that opportunity for those student athletes. Now, there are still some limitations, and these limitations are consistent with those general principles that were provided by the Board of Governors. And the first one is it may not be used as a recruiting inducement. So institutions cannot use potential promotional opportunities in order to entice a student athlete to attend their institution. Institutions also may not be involved in the development, operation, or promotion of a student athlete's work product or service or facilitating promotional activities. Now, institutions will be involved to some extent in this area, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. But as far as facilitating or developing these opportunities for student athletes, they cannot be involved in that manner. And then finally, student athletes may not promote commercial products prohibited by NCAA or by the institution. So what does this mean? Well, first, by the institution, it's really an institutional autonomy issue. If there are certain products or services that are inconsistent with an institutional mission, and the institution prohibits any student from using their status or associated with that institution to promote that product, then student athletes wouldn't be allowed either. So while this proposal is certainly more permissive, there is areas for institutions to be more restrictive as long as they're treating their students and student athletes similarly. Additionally, promoting products such as tobacco or services such as gambling that are contrary to NCAA legislation, that also would be prohibited forms of promotion for student athletes. Now, as noted before, institutional involvement, there is and has to be some institutional involvement. Certainly, the obligation to educate their student athletes on what they can and can't do, and having those conversations. Talking about reporting expectations. While there's no mandatory reporting to the NCAA of NIL opportunities, certainly student athletes should be discussing these opportunities with their institution to determine if they are or not permissible use of using their NIL for promotional opportunities. And the institution can assist these student athletes when they're talking about evaluating different opportunities or evaluating professional service providers. And we'll talk about professional service providers in just a moment. But it's not a matter of leaving these student athletes in this world where certainly there's business opportunities, regulatory issues beyond NCAA regulations. Certainly they can assist in that manner and help student athletes through this process. Use of institutional marks, and this is an area where, if you're tracking this issue on all three divisions, where we may be a little bit different as these proposals go forward. And when we talk about institutional marks, we're talking about any sort of protected name or identifying mark of the institution, and there's certainly some examples here on the slide. From a Division III perspective, with respect to this proposal, student athletes would be allowed to use institutional marks in the same manner students generally are allowed to use those marks, or the process to obtain use of those marks to promote their own work product or service, or in the promotion of third-party products or services. So it is a permissive legislation contingent on what the institutional process is for all students at that university. The last piece is student athletes may not appear in their uniform or athletics apparel, either when promoting their own work product or promoting third-party products or services. And the rationale between that is student athletes have unique access to that apparel that students generally would not. And it also further blurs the line on institutional involvement and some of the principles set forth by the association-wide working group. So sorry, Louise, I didn't mean to cut you off, but if you have a question, it'd be great to hear it.
I do, Jeff, and it's back a couple slides, but we don't need to go back. And the question is in regard to the limitations. If a sports information director or an athletic communication director wrote an article about a student athlete and their product, would that be considered a violation? In that the institution would be involved in the promotion? Sure.
And I think you have to look at really the facts of it and how they're writing it. But assuming they're writing it as informational for their campus community, for their alumni, for the community in general, and they would do it for any student at that university. So the student athlete writes a book about their experiences and is promoting it. And the SID wants to put that story on their athletics webpage. I think it's pretty safe to say that that institution would also do that if that student wrote a book and they weren't an athlete. And so that's the analysis to go through there. So it's not that they're necessarily promoting their product as much as it's an informational article about a student at their university. So compliance responsibilities, as we've held these webinars and the survey for the past year regarding these concepts, compliance, ability for Division III institutions to monitor these activities has been a reoccurring theme and concern for the membership. And certainly the Interpretations Committee struggled with this piece as well. It was concerned about it. A couple pieces regarding the legislation. One, there's no mandatory reporting requirements to the NCAA. So similar to other activities that your student athletes may be engaging in that may or may not be consistent with NCAA regulations, unless there is a violation, there's not a mandatory reporting requirement. So institutions will not be required to report to the NCAA all NIL activities of their student athletes. As the committee discussed the legislation regarding what, if any, requirements should be put in place, they viewed it primarily as similar to other NCAA regulated areas where the focus, especially for Division III institutions, is going to be on education, educating their student athletes, educating their coaches, educating their boosters on what is and what is not permissible, and then monitoring to the extent that that is feasible. And that's the way they viewed it. Certainly they understood that a lot of this activity is occurring now. And again, going back to the existing legislation where student athletes are allowed to promote commercial products and services under certain limitations, the committee felt that, excuse me, this being more permissible in some ways lessened the compliance responsibilities. The next piece, the third-party compliance administrator. The NCAA currently is reviewing potential third-party vendors to assist both institutions and student athletes in this area that most of the association, most of their student athletes have not been involved in. To the extent that this becomes a viable option for NCAA institutions and Division III institutions in particular, we don't know yet, but it's a possible option to help institutions educate their constituency, to evaluate NIL opportunities, and in the general compliance realm. So there is some actions by the NCAA taking a look at how third-party administrators could potentially help in this area. And then certainly there'll be educational materials produced by the NCAA as we go forward, coming out of convention to look how best to help our member institutions and what resources can be helpful for them. I mentioned before we get back to professional service providers, and here we are. As the committee looked at the greater allowance here and understanding that student athletes would now be engaging in essentially business of their own, they would need access to professional service providers. So I skipped down to the second bullet point and we talk about agents here. Obviously, agents are not permissible throughout NCAA legislation. Here they would be allowed for purposes of marketing a student athlete's name, image, and likeness. Still would not be permissible to have an agent to market professional sports opportunities. So there is some additional flexibility here, but not complete flexibility to allow agents for professional sports opportunities. Certainly greater access to tax advisors, marketing consultants, and so on. And that's part of this legislation to clarify that professional service providers are permissible in this area of NIL. And then finally, institutions may be involved in helping student athletes that, these professional service providers. These student athletes may be engaging in activities in which they're not familiar with, and institutions may be better positioned to help in this area. It's not required, but it would be permissive legislation to allow institutions to do that. And then the final area I just want to address is boosters. And this is probably the area where the committee wrestled with the most. Certainly understanding that in the area with boosters is probably the biggest area for potential abuse, but also the largest area for opportunities for student athletes. And ultimately, the committee came out saying that any potential abuse was outweighed by the benefit to our student athletes and the benefit to the institution and the institutional communities. So similar to now, boosters can hire student athletes for employment. Here they could hire student athletes to promote their business. They could purchase a student athlete's product or service. They could act as professional service providers. They still cannot be involved in the recruiting process, or promotional opportunities can't be used as part of the recruiting process, but ultimately looking at an extra benefit analysis and not allowing boosters to engage in these different activities. The committee ultimately determined that it put both the institution and student athlete at odds, potential wrestling for these different opportunities, and also create an unreasonable burden for the institution to monitor. And so ultimately, boosters can be involved in this process, but it goes back again to that educational piece. Educating the student athlete, educating the boosters on what is and what generally is not permissible. And I know we're coming up on time, so just the last piece here is, again, we will have the vote at the virtual convention in January. We will discuss this again at the Issues Forum, but also there's the Q&A that's available online as well. So with that, Louise, I know we're about out of time, but is there any questions that we need to address?
So Jeff, there are two questions. One is very high level, one's in the weeds. We'll try to do it quickly if possible, but the high level one is, the question is, if an institution doesn't have policies around name, image, and likeness for their students generally, does that mean that it's really all of this is a no-go for student athletes until the institution develops a policy?
I think it would be viewed the opposite. They're not going to be restricted on what they can and can't do until there's policies that restrict it for students generally. So if the institution doesn't have any policies, then nothing's precluding a student from promoting any product or service, even if it conflicts with the missions of the institution. Similarly, a student athlete couldn't be then prohibited from doing so. So effectively, if there's no policies that the institution has, then presumably it's open to students and presumably open to student athletes as well.
Jeff, the other question is, if more in the weeds, if the promotional photo is a game photo where the institutional logos have been digitally removed, would that be acceptable?
I think that's a fair question. I think as we sit here, the institution's uniform still couldn't be identified. So if it's merely removing the logo, but it's clearly the uniform of the institution in the institution's arena or field of play, I think you're starting to get into those nuances of, are they identified with the institutional team of that for that university?
And Jeff, one last question came in, and this will be the final question, but I think it's a good one. What it says is that in Division III, an institution or conference can develop rules that are more restrictive than NCAA policy. So if this proposal passes, could a Division III institution or conference simply adopt a more restrictive rule than the NCAA NIL policy and prohibit their student athletes from engaging in athletically related NIL opportunities?
I think that is a great question, Louise. And, I think I'm going to answer it two ways. I think the first piece is the foundational premise of this proposal is that student athletes are treated similarly to students. So if the conferences and the institution are establishing rules that apply only to the student athletes and have greater allowances for students generally, I think there's some friction there. And then I'll follow up with the complete punt. And ultimately, I think this is something that we need to discuss with our legal counsel on this issue. And part of the reason for these the webinars to hear questions like this that we can eventually incorporate into the Q&A. So I will give a partial answer and a non-answer on that, Louise.
Well, Jeff, we really appreciate your time, the last 30 minutes. Thanks to everybody that participated today, the questions we received. Both this PowerPoint and the recording will be located on the Division III webinar page that is on nca.org. We wish you all the best to continue to be safe and healthy as we head into the December holidays. And we hope to see all of you at the virtual NCAA convention in mid-January. So Jeff, thanks again for everything. Thanks to everybody else.